So our next speaker today is Associate Professor Shauna Murray from the University of Technology in Sydney. Shauna is going to be talking to us today about one of the earliest projects that we had at Food Agility, which was Oyster Industry Transformation Program, building sustainability and profitability in the Australian oyster industry. Now, I guess this project, it has completed now. It was one that we've run for a few years and it finished off earlier in the year, but it did exist to improve regulatory procedures and help farmers improve harvest management through digital tools using real-time water quality sensing combined with breakthrough molecular techniques and data-fueled models. So, Shauna, it's all yours. If you can turn your camera on so we can see you, but we've got your screen.
Great, thanks a lot, Mick, and thanks over to Food Agility for inviting us to talk about our project. It's very exciting to be able to present it. So as Mick just mentioned, so this project's actually finished now. It ran from 2018 to 2020. And it was our first foray into how to use real-time sensing for the oyster industry to look at water quality. So we were a varied team made up of researchers from UTS and the DPI, who are the regulator of the industry. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, and in general food safety regulation and why that's so critical for this industry. Oyster researchers, so they were aquaculture researchers, also from New South Wales DPI. And then, of course, the Yield, who were the technology provider. And we also had Hunter Local Land Services. So they also had an interest in water quality for a whole range of other reasons. So hang on a minute, I'll work out why that's not changing. Okay, so just to give you, I'll start with a bit of background into the oyster industry because it's actually a fairly unusual and unique industry in many ways. The Sydney rock oyster, which is the major species produced in New South Wales, it's something like more than 90% or so of the value of the industry. It's an endemic species to Eastern Australia that ranges from naturally from southern Queensland region all the way down to Victoria. And it's been commercially farmed for around about 150 years, starting around 1870. And sustainably for that time. So, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But prior to that, it was very important as a food source for Indigenous communities right throughout Australia. And you see evidence of that in middens going back thousands of years, composed largely of Sydney rock oyster shell. It's now our state's largest fishery sector. And I want to point out that this project was focused on the New South Wales industry largely because that's who we spoke to and worked with. But this particular species is commercially farmed in other states as well. And other oyster species, particularly the Pacific oyster, is also farmed somewhat in New South Wales and more extensively South Australia has a big industry. Tasmania, of course, has a big Pacific oyster industry, and WA is now starting its own Sydney rock oyster industry and a little bit of Pacifics. So aside from that, there was a study done a couple of years ago on the cultural value of the oyster industry in New South Wales, particularly regional communities, and those connections with tourism and many other sectors. It's a long historical tradition, so it's got a lot of cultural values. And then finally, another sort of unusual feature about this particular species, agricultural species, is that it's highly sustainable. So a few different studies have shown that it's the most sustainable animal protein source in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And as I said, unusual in the sense that we have some of the estuaries, for example, Port Stephens, which is one of the largest commercial harvest estuaries for oysters in the state, in which you also get oysters being used for ecological restoration in that same estuary at the same time, because it's been found to be a really good species for actually filter feeding and therefore removing particles from the water column, and also providing habitat for many other species. So in terms of oyster farming, I've titled this one The Highs and the Lows because it's a particularly difficult industry for a whole range of reasons. And these are just some of the headlines from the ABC website for the past year. So you can imagine, what the industry faces on a daily basis. So they're basically particularly susceptible to a range of diseases, and the QX disease and winter mortality are the particular diseases that Sydney rock oysters face. And currently there is actually a QX disease outbreak in New South Wales. Rain and water quality is a huge issue for the oyster industry. And they've been, as we know, over the past couple of years, heavy rainfall events and flooding events. And wastewater is, of course, another big issue. So, as I said, it's extremely susceptible to poor water quality. Oysters are filter feeders. So basically anything in the estuary will end up in the oyster. So because of this, food safety regulation is really important. Oysters are considered a high-risk food. And so whenever, if in doubt, the food safety regulator will close harvesting in order to protect public health if there's any kind of water quality risk. And the major water quality risks that we're talking about here will be things like rainfall events. And the reason rainfall events are dangerous is not because of rainfall per se in and of itself. It's because rainfall is associated with land runoff. And land runoff can bring dangerous and pathogenic bacteria into the water column. For example, E. coli is a typical microbiological indicator that people probably have heard of. And there's also things like enterococci and so on. And of course, there are viruses that can be associated with or can end up in the water column, end up in an oyster, and have been associated with food safety problems. So it was exactly one of these virus type events that initiated the stringent food safety that we have these days for the shellfish industry in general in Australia. And that was, people might remember back to the hepatitis incidents from the Wallace Lake oysters that happened in the 1990s. So really important. But then, of course, there's a risk. So if in doubt, the regulator is going to close down harvesting. And so these are going to be conservative by their very nature, and perhaps a lot more conservative than they need to be. But to be able to change that, we obviously need better data. So, and just an example here of some of the water quality risks that I was talking about. So the pathogenic bacteria, obviously indicators are after rainfall events or, for example, sewage spills and so on. That's one big association. But another one that might be a little bit harder to necessarily see is harmful algal blooms. And this is something that my group at UTS has been researching for many years, which are basically marine microalgae that naturally occur in the water column, and under certain circumstances can become very abundant. And there's not necessarily any particular way of detecting that's simple or straightforward, because, for example, certain species might produce harmful toxins in the water column, which can end up in the oyster, even when there is as few as 100 cells per litre or a couple of hundred cells per litre. So that's not a density that you're ever going to be able to detect through something like remote sensing, for example, because at the same time in the water column, there'll be other microbial species that will be present in thousands and tens of thousands of cells. So this is an example. This was a couple of years ago, a PhD student of mine in Tasmania was sampling, and it also connected to oyster farms. There's a lot of oyster farming along the east coast of Tasmania. Beautiful day, the water looked clear, and then it turned out later on when we were analysing the samples that there were about 10 to the 6 cells per litre of Alexandrian catenella, which is producing a toxin called paralytic shellfish toxin. The mussels locally had 140 milligrams per kilo of paralytic shellfish toxins in them at that time. So that's about 175 times the safe limit of that particular toxin, and unfortunately a couple of people had to be treated in hospital who recreationally harvested some oysters from around the rocks there. Nothing obviously connected with the commercial industry because they have quite stringent food safety regulation, which we were talking about. So I said before, the regulator is conservative, but monitoring water quality is difficult. And the way in which it's done all around the world and in New South Wales, Australia generally, is that samples are collected usually by a particular oyster farmer who is trained in sample collection techniques, and then they're transported to a specialised lab, and the transport process itself takes at least take some time, and then the transport plus the processing and getting a result to the regulator takes at least 24 to 72 hours. So whether that's growing up the water sample to determine the levels of E. coli in it, or whether that's checking for harmful algae, during that time, the food safety regulator doesn't have a regular answer. So for that reason, management needs to be conservative, and if in doubt, the harvesting will be closed until the result is available. So the question being, how can we maximise both oyster harvesting time available and food safety? So our project was aiming to increase days available for oyster harvesting in New South Wales. And a secondary aim was to better predict things like harmful algal blooms, as I just shown you, oyster disease, which also mentioned it can be devastating, and also things like oyster growth. So we were aiming to do this through analysing E. coli and HABs, harmful algal blooms in water, as well as oysters in relation to temperature and salinity in 13 oyster-producing estuaries in New South Wales. And as I've mentioned, this is a partnership. So the regulators of the industry are the New South Wales DPI, formerly called the Food Authority, but now part of Biosecurity and Food Safety. Scientists, as in ourselves, and also the New South Wales DPI Aquaculture, the New South Wales oyster farmers themselves, who, as you'll see in a moment, took all the samples, and our technology partners, the Yield. So these were the estuaries that we worked in, from the Hastings River in the north all the way down to Womboyne, which is on the Victorian border. And what we did, in fact, was take biological data, and that is water samples and oyster samples, and physical data. So that is our real-time temperature and salinity sensors provided by the Yield, which had a web interface which the farmers were then able to use to access the data. And then in terms of physical biological samples, the samples were then preserved. We would then extract them using a technique called eDNA, which is environmental DNA, and then use techniques such as qPCR to determine the numbers of E. coli and harmful algal blooms in the samples, and then model it for things like HABs and oyster diseases. So, So to do this, we were obviously not going to be able to collect all the samples ourselves. So one of the major issues with water, estuarine environments, is that they're highly variable and they fluctuate really quickly. So what you find is that we needed to sample quite frequently, such as on a weekly basis, if we were going to be able to making a determination of water quality. So we were never going to be able to take weekly samples from 13 estuaries in a small team at UTS of just a couple of people and continue that for 2 years. So we held a series of workshops up and down the coast with the oyster farmers where we developed our own sampling method, which is different to how scientists would normally take these kinds of water samples. But we knew that they don't have a lab, they may not even have electricity available at their oyster shed. And so we wanted something as low tech as possible that we could train an oyster farmer to do fairly simply, and could end up with a sample that could be stored for some time until we come along and collect it. And we also had test oysters that were provided by the Aquaculture Research Group. And these were oysters that had been selectively bred to be identical and that we would place in each of these 13 estuaries. So in terms of results, so we had 13 estuaries, as I mentioned, engaged in the project and farmers accessing and using the real-time salinity data. During the project, the DPI regulator then were slowly working through estuary by estuary what data they had available in terms of determining which estuaries could be offered management plans that would be based on salinity data from the sensor rather than what they were using before, such as the rainfall data and waiting for the lab results. And 3 estuaries during the project are now using, and they have converted over to be using salinity-only management plans. And these are Hawkesbury, Pambula and Port Stephens, one of the sites in Port Stephens. We've also designed some new qPCR assays, which are a method to detect E. coli and harmful algal species using the eDNA and qPCR methods we talked about. And we've done an economic analysis of salinity-only management. So these are just some of the plots, so you can see some of the salinity readings over 3 years of data. So basically, there's a drought for the first 2 years and it's very high salinity, and then suddenly you see that there was a flood event right towards the end of the project. That's what it looks like in most estuaries. This is some of the other data we've gathered on oyster growth and the shell length in all of the different estuaries. So we're still analysing all of this as part of a second project, which is actually going to be presented by Dr. Penny Ajani, who's was involved in this. In terms of the economic analysis, so this was done by the DPI economists. So what they did is they took 2 of the estuaries that were involved in the project and who had adopted real-time harvest area management plans that were based on real-time salinity and temperature sensing, which meant that their harvest area opening and closure was no longer based on rainfall and some of those other parameters, but was based more directly on salinity because the data showed that there was a strong correlation. So these 2 estuaries were offered them. And the DPI economists found that there was a net present value in terms of Pambula, it was $1,400 a hectare. In Cromarty Bay, it was $862 a hectare. So what that amounted to was that basically Pambula Lake Estuary would have paid for their sensor in the first year from their increased profits, and Cromarty in their second year. And so we then extrapolated up from those results to the whole industry and found that there'd be about a $3 million per annum estimated additional farm gate value in New South Wales for that industry we've taken up. So that's off a current $55 million value. So that's fairly significant for that industry. We also did some surveys with farmers about the project, about what they thought of the project, what they wanted to focus on, and so on. And we found it was slightly different in different estuaries, which we expected, because different estuaries have different water quality issues. In some places, harmful algal blooms are more important. In other areas, it's disease and stock losses. But generally, people were very supportive of the project. and they were using the app, they were using the information. And that it was quite interesting for our future project that Penny's going to talk about in a little while. Some of their top priorities, if we continue the project, were disease and reduced stock mortalities, more information on oyster growth, and the prediction of harmful algal blooms, and this developing monitoring tools so that they could monitor themselves. So we've actually taken up all of that, and all of that is in our next project that Penny will talk about. Unexpected challenges, because Dave said the gnarly, so I thought I'd put up a slide of the gnarly for us. So for us, for the first 2 years of the project, there was a drought. So that meant there was particularly low rainfall, which made it difficult to measure the impact of rainfall, which was one of the major goals of the project, to look at that salinity decrease in relation to increased rainfall, and look at our oyster area harvesting, opening and closures. But nevertheless, towards the end of the project, we did get some flood events. So we had enough rainfall events by the end of it to be predictive. But yeah, talking about the floods, they were obviously devastating. Some businesses lost all their oysters and most of their infrastructure. That was a quote from a farmer on the Macleay River in Port Macquarie, that he'd never seen anything like it. And he lost 1 million oysters in that flood event. Bushfires also happened right in the middle of our project. So, and they had direct impacts. There were at least one oyster farmer whose shed was burnt down, and there were oyster farmers that were members of the RFS and so on. And then there were runoff issues into the estuaries, killing oysters and causing water quality problems. For us, the technology partner, so the Yield, actually changed its business model during our project. So that caused a few changes, and it was nothing that wasn't dealt with. And then finally, COVID-19, which had a devastating impact on oyster sales for a certain period. I think that they were able to redeem themselves by the end of last year, and had a really big Christmas finish after losing up to 100% of their sales at some point. So yeah, lots of unexpected things during the project. So yeah, I'll just conclude now. So in our project, we showed that real-time temperature and salinity sensing had considerable promise for the oyster industry, both in terms of allowing for rapid harvest area opening and closure decisions, particularly around rainfall, and then also for a range of other factors, which is what led us to our second project. And that in terms of the rainfall specifically, moving to opening and closure based on real-time salinity sensing was increased the harvest time available to farmers by up to around 3 weeks per annum. And if this was widely taken up across the industry, it would substantially increase profitability and allow for growth of the industry. So as I mentioned, there was considerable scope and interest by the farmers in these co-benefits, such as using the data we've collected for modelling and prediction of harmful algal blooms and oyster disease and oyster growth, and for more on-farm monitoring. So I'll leave it there and just acknowledge and thank everyone involved, which is all the people from DPI, BTS, the Yield and Hunter Local Land Services. But I think more than anyone, we really need to be thanking the oyster farmers, because the citizen science angle they actually took, I was trying to calculate it up, but it must be more than 1,300 hours of sampling time that they contributed to this project. So it would be nothing without them. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks, Shauna, and thanks for the great presentation. It was really good to see, I guess, the results of all the different areas of work that went into this project. And, myself as an oyster eater, I'm very much thankful for obviously keeping the waterways open for just a little bit longer. And as you said there at the end, up to an extra 3 weeks of harvesting is a fantastic result for the New South Wales industry. And, obviously scaling, hopefully you can scale that nationally. It makes it a much more sustainable industry. So fantastic. Thank you. And, You've already answered a couple of questions for me, which was, around the gnarly points. But I guess from a eureka perspective, what was your eureka moment within this project?
I think there were several. I mean, there were different ones, but I think early on, when we were trying to work out how we were going to do the sample collection, and it became more and more obvious that we were never going to be able to do it all ourselves, and that this was going to be a citizen science project. And then working out how we did it as a citizen science project. How would we actually could we devise a way that the oyster farmers could collect those samples and store them for large periods of time, but still have eDNA samples that were usable, and at a standard where, for a scientific project. So I think that was one. And then, of course, just seeing the result once the DPI economists looked at the data and what they came up with was also pretty satisfying. So I'd say probably those ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a $3 million impact, New South Wales wide, it's fantastic. Just to see, using this sensing way of sensing the salinity, it's fantastic to see that sort of management change. I did have a question around, I guess, early on you mentioned that it took between 24 and 72 hours to get the results back of any of the testing that's done on farm. And obviously that's a long time that clearly you have to wait between harvesting and shutting down and like a harvest, I guess, period. You mentioned that, if in doubt, they'll shut it down. So how did farmers, or I guess the industry, make the decision that yes, they're in doubt and they will make the decision to close down before getting those results back?
Well, this is all more on the regulator side. So the industry themselves wouldn't be the ones making that decision about closures. Mm-hmm. It would be the DPI regulators saying to them, look, we've had all this rainfall, we're waiting for a result, but because we've had this rainfall, even though we haven't got the result yet, we don't know whether there is any high E. coli, we're just going to close you anyway. It would be more like things like that. And then I guess this project showing that, well, maybe they were being on the conservative side, which is probably what you want in a food safety regulator, but they can actually scale it back a bit and it's still safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that conservative side, you can see from the slides you showed about Tasmania and seeing the very low levels of those bacteria being present in the water per litre, it's still enough to make people very sick if they were to eat those oysters as well. And so the risks are clearly evident there from a disease and as well as just anything else that's in the water perspective.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, those particular, I mean, I probably should stress that that's not an everyday occurrence, no. The paralytic shellfish toxins, but with the bacteria, it is quite common. And, that's not going to turn people paralytic, but probably just give them an upset tummy. And we don't want that either. So, it's all about industry reputation as well. And these things can have long-term impacts. So yeah, definitely the conservative approach is the right one from the food safety perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a final point from me, a big thank you from our food agility team. You've taught all of us a lot about water science, and particularly Dave and myself. We're physicists, and I think Dave might have put a comment in here saying, thanking you and your team for teaching a couple of physicists about water science and water quality. We have learned a lot from this project, and it's been one of the, I guess, highest impact ones we've had. So it's been great to work with you all, and thank you very much. And looking forward to hearing from, I think, Penny later on today, talking about the second project. So that'll be great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mick.
All righty. Well, thanks, Shauna, and